Welcome to a really fascinating interview with David Bentley Hart on Romans 5 verse 12. This interview builds upon the interview I did with David a couple of weeks ago on sin and the nature of sin, and in particular how best to translate or not translate the word hamartia. We were at that time going to include in that same interview a discussion of his translation of Romans 5 verse 12, which really bears on the topic of original sin. But time ran away with us, and so I separated that out. This is actually the first half of the interview I did with David. I made the decision to cut it in two because it is so rich and the information is so important, the paradigms are so important, that I think you need some time to absorb them. The first interview, the first part of the interview, will focus upon the paradigm of original sin, what that particular conceptual framework looks like. What are the candidate meanings of that word? And that's what you're about to hear in this following roughly 30 minutes. It'll follow quite a clear structure, which is I begin by asking David what he thinks the term original sin means, and from there we go into a discussion of the history of the development of this term and really the contrasting interpretations between the East and the West. The second interview, which we'll post in a few days, we dive down into the grammar and wording of Romans 5 verse 12 and associated verses. I trust you'll enjoy this. I think it's really important because the whole of Christianity is really built upon a system of salvation, and if there's a system of salvation, the question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And Christians have historically said it's sin. And I think this interview will vastly challenge that as an incomplete answer. Welcome, David, again to Gospel Conversations and to the Antipodes.
Thanks again. I wish I were there in person.
Yes. Well, last time you and I talked, we spoke about sin and the inadequacy of that word and its connotations, searched around for an alternative, but really tried to clear up the kind of conceptual territory around what's better called missing of the mark. By the way, I think I mentioned to you that when John Bear was here, I ran past him your unease with the word sin as a translation of whatever hamartia might mean. And he agreed. So he also thought that our modern word sin, which now carries a freight load of
2 millennia of theological incrustations, I guess you'd say.
Indeed. So, but leaving that aside, we're now going to go to something quite specific but significant, rather pivotal in your translation of the New Testament, and that is Romans 5 verse 12. I want us to dive into the actual grammar and the significance of the grammar at one point. Don't want to start there though, because really Romans 5 clearly is fairly pivotal in Paul's theological imagination. That's very, very obvious. Your comment on how you chose to translate Romans 5 verse 12, however, says that the traditional renderings really have supported the concept of, let's call it original sin, which is a bit of a murky phrase, but I'd like to start there. Now, could you give your understanding of that term and its theological and psychological landscape?
How do I understand the term original sin? All right. I understand it as having two possible connotations. One is simply the universal affirmation of all Christian traditions that we in this world are in a condition of alienation from God and from our own proper natural ends in God, and not just us, but the whole of creation. That that in a basic sense is simply the notion that sin and death, whatever sin is, however we define it, is a condition like a disease that we contracted in being born. In the West, more than in the East, much more in the West, it acquired the additional notion of a kind of forensic guilt, a sort of blameworthiness before the tribunal of God, so to speak, right? And that really is the focus in most Latin tradition after the first, say, 3 or 4 centuries, becoming the central conception to a very large degree well into the 16th, and especially in the 16th centuries, 16th and 17th centuries. And as early as, say, the 9th century, in Constantinople, the Patriarch Photius, on being informed of this, thought it was it verged on heresy. It was the notion of a sin of nature, and you realize that there was some great conceptual disconnect between East and West on this. And it's not simply a matter of confessional loyalty that makes me say that the Eastern Fathers, I think, are much closer to the actual language of Scripture, in which the emphasis is not upon guilt, but upon enslavement. And the metaphors that naturally occur and that are used by Paul, for instance, are not so much that we're born guilty, but that we're born like slaves under an unjust legal compact which binds us in a household that is not our true home, against our wills, but not because we're culpable, not because we're born culpable, but because this is simply the unfortunate situation that requires rectification. And you can trace historically how this came about. But those are the two broad definitions I would offer. One is simply a condition of alienation, but the other, and more specifically, is a condition of guilt that, in some sense, means that we are born, in the language of Augustine, as a massa damnanda or a massa damnata, a damnable or damned totality, mass, in the eyes of the Father, and rather than simply being rescued from slavery, we need to have our guilt discharged, our debt of guilt discharged by some legal mechanism, and even, as it turns out, a somewhat draconian legal mechanism. And as I say, one can trace out historically how this division of this hermeneutical division occurs in Christian tradition.
Out of interest, I am intrigued by at least a sketch of how you saw that historical journey happening.
Well, part of it is simply translation. We're going to get to the issue of Romans 5:12, so I can set that aside for just a moment. But part of it is the way in which the legal metaphors became subtly altered in their movement from east to west, because the language that Paul uses and the terms he uses are, to a very great extent, matters of civil law. They have to do basically with slavery and manumission and the laws of emancipation. For instance, a word that is often, two words are often translated as ransom, for instance, in the Authorized or the King James Version and later translations, litron or antilithron. I won't use the Erasmian pronunciation because that is damnable in the eyes of God, but litron really doesn't mean a ransom. You can use it so much as a fee that is required to discharge a civil, legal, contractual debt. In this case, when a slave was given manumission, was manumitted, a fee had to be paid. This was legally required. There had to be a fee which certified that the contract had been discharged in a different way. And that's the language that Paul is using. But in a lot of Latin theology, especially after the late period of the late Augustine, that language becomes the language of a debt of guilt before a legal tribunal or before the assize. In the same way, for instance, the word used in the Lord's Prayer and elsewhere in the New Testament for what's translated as trespasses for instance, in our common translation of the Lord's Prayer, ophelimata, debts really meant civil debts you owed a creditor, sometimes an unjust or an unkind creditor. And in fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, that creditor really is an unjust human, poneros, an evil man, a rogue, someone who's tricked you into debt. A lot of the Sermon on the Mount is about how, don't listen to people who swear by the heavens or by Jerusalem or whatever, who say not just yes or no, but who make extravagant promises, because all of that comes from what the Greek says, from the evil man, from the evil person, because he's trying to trick you. And that's sort of the metaphor being used of the devil and of death. We've been tricked. We've been enslaved. And, so Christ is using the imagery of the greatest injustice of his time, the way the poor are plundered by the wealthy and then reduced to slavery. Well, that becomes, you have the language of debts, debita, but also it gets subtly conflated with culpae, sins, transgressions in Western theology as well. And so we go from a civil legal setting to a criminal legal setting. All right. Now, as I say, part of these are just the vagaries of translation, the vagaries of different cultural usage, but it all ultimately comes back, as you've already sort of foreshadowed. It comes back to the theological weight placed upon Romans 5, and placed upon Romans 5 through the alembic, so to speak, of translation into Latin. Translations in English leave some of that language ambiguous, but the translation in Latin was very consequential, because that one chapter, which I know we're going to talk about in a moment, that one verse was crucial for the whole debate, all the theology of original sin.
Yes.
And so how it was construed, what people thought that verse said and what that chapter was talking about, crucially determined how the two halves of the Christian world would think of sin.
And so just to pause there, because I think what you've said is very helpful. As you and I would 100% agree, metaphors are not just incidental matters of style. They invoke a whole worldview and a landscape.
And the whole world of associated metaphors. They're
a whole world
enjambed, within linguistic economies.
That's right, and that's the way our mind works. Our mind works by rapid associations, and of course, in the hands of either a good orator or a good but sinister orator, they can really manipulate our psyche by invoking metaphors that actually, without us knowing it, really stir up deep subconscious fears or anxieties we might have. So the move, as I see it, which you've just talked about, from civil law to criminal law, is actually extremely significant, because if I'm in the field of what you've called civil law, then I'm in the field, as you know, I view Exodus as probably the best analogy of the situation, which is a situation of enslavement to a tyrant. And it is therefore a systemic view of what's wrong. Enslavement is not something it's really not something that is primarily individual. It's a system at work. I have to play inside of that system. And if I'm a victim inside of that system, I've got no agency whatsoever. Whereas the judicial metaphor is very susceptible to being individualized and psychologized.
And I mean, that's nothing less than a measure of justice, right? You don't want the criminal law to be collective.
No.
And so there's a sound impulse there, which is if we're talking about guilt, it must in some sense be justly attributed to the individual. So how do you do this? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what you've said about the move to guilt, so once I move into criminal law, I'm in guilt. Whereas if I'm in the law, in the civil law, or particularly the enslavement territory, it isn't so much guilt as weakness, or something like that. And in a way, that if I place the problem of quote unquote redemption in the civil law, it's a bigger problem because I can't just, save people one on one. I've got to transform the entire system of enslavement, which of course is the wonder of the gospel. But I wanted to raise another point, which I believe, as has happened in the Western tradition and the Augustinian view, the Calvinistic view, because I confront this fairly regularly amongst very well-meaning Christians I know, who it's gone beyond guilt into depravity of nature.
Yeah.
And why that needed to happen, I don't know, but I actually suspect that once I move the locus of the problem to the forensic, it's a very quick step into things like a feeling of guilt.
And also I think it's a rationalization that something in the mind resists the notion that God would be so unjust as to ascribe guilt to us if that guilt were not truly, in some sense, within us. I mean, there's always this concern for exculpating God, even as we inculpate ourselves, which again can be a healthy theological or spiritual impulse, but if it's based on defective principles, the result can be fairly monstrous, even.
Yes, it is. It is, and well, I think the other change as we move between these two systems of psychological landscapes is that in the civil law, I, the victim, my antagonist is whoever owns the slave system, which is going to be Satan or the devil. It's not going to be God. It's not his system. Whereas once I move to the other system of forensic guilt, then my antagonist becomes God because he's the judge. He's now brought into the metaphorical landscape, but in the enslavement, he's not. Insofar as he's in the enslavement, he's the one who pays the fee for us. He gets us. He's the solver of the problem. And it's I just wanted to pursue for a moment this what I'd call psychologizing of guilt, because for a lot of people it's very unfortunate. And I actually had a couple of quotes. One is from Augustine, who began the trend. Which this is what he said about Romans 5:12, in whom all sin. He said, Adam depraved in himself by the hidden corruption of his carnal concupiscence, all who came out of this stock. So the idea of a depravity that's now, it isn't just a guilt, it's a depravity that's going to justify the guilt, and it's actually in the genes now. So I'm going to be born depraved, is literally what he said. And then dear old Calvin, I mean, hate to make him a whipping boy, but he does deserve it. So
I was about to say he's very convenient, in that regard.
He's very good. What I like about Calvin is at least he is logic.
No duplicity, there's no evasiveness, and it's beautifully written. So
yeah, correct. And so it does us a good service, therefore, to characterize a certain way of thinking. This is what he said: to sin is in this case to be corrupt and invitiated, for that natural depravity, which we bring from our mother's womb, so it does not immediately bring forth its fruits, is never. So when we're born, it doesn't immediately bring forth its fruits, but the disease is in there, is nevertheless sin in the sight of God and deserves his vengeance. And this is the sin which they call original. For Adam at his first creation received both for himself and posterity the gifts of divine favour. So by falling away from the Lord, he in himself corrupted, vitiated, depraved, and ruined our nature. So that's where Reggie, settle down. Reggie was horrified by Calvin. He's walked out of the room now in disgust. But so that's where it's now become psychological. It's become and once you tell little children this kind of thing, and once you make this an anthropology, its effect is, I think, insidious.
Oh no, I think some of the psychological abuse that has gone under the name of Christian upbringing over the centuries as a result of how I would say how far astray the tradition, parts of the tradition have gone in thinking of sin is really quite horrendous. You know, I even feel a little pangs of sympathy for Richard Dawkins when he talks about certain aspects of Christian teaching as child abuse. You know,
Yeah,
because yes, they are. And I was shown actually a cartoon that was produced for a sort of very hard, sort of rock-ribbed Calvinist congregation for children. That was some of the most horrifying stuff I've ever. It's a sign of a small child in a cage dangling over an ocean of fire. Say, this is how you're born.
wow,
You know,
wow.
you know,
Well,
I would step back. You know, it's interesting. There, the two comments I wanted to make. One about a point you made earlier, and that we'll probably come back to because I think we probably will talk about the structural aspects of sin. But you notice, you know, just as we said that this emphasis upon guilt sort of inexorably forces a lot of later Western theology toward the notion that we really must be culpable and it can't be God's fault, right? We are as culpable as the devil, right? Mm-hmm. But it's funny, if you don't have that, if that notion of it, if you see rather as our condition is one in which we're trapped structurally and from which we are rescued by a God who descends into our state of alienation and sets us free. You know, he's you know, a more Moses figure in this story, Christ's where then the pressure goes in quite the opposite direction, because one of the truths about structures of evil is that even those who are the perpetrators of evil are themselves victims of the structure. And the most probably luminously disorienting one, if you start from the later Western tradition, is when you read Gregory of Nyssa, say in the great oration, the catechetical oration, in which he says, yes, the devil is his kingdom is overthrown when he seizes Christ as the litron, the manumission fee, and finds that in doing that, in taking he's legally entitled to this fee, but in doing it, he tries to seize hold, he discovers, of the infinite Godhead, which death cannot contain, and so his whole kingdom is overthrown. Gregory then goes on to say that, but in the end, this is not unjust either. This isn't God practicing deception, because God's also freeing the devil from it. It actually redounds to the good of the devil. This is one of the places where you get in Gregory, you realize that he really means what he says when all rational natures must be saved. He means that even the devil has been rescued, because the structures of evil, in a sense, make us all complicit, but also make us all victims of the structures of sin. And so, I mean, it's funny how if you go in one direction, you end up having to locate actual guilt in everyone other than God, and then somehow work very hard to say how God's not guilty, because he's obviously attributing guilt to those who are freshly born into this world, and that is a forensic category. It's not. It shouldn't be in sort of an ontological condition. And if you go in the other direction, you do move inexorably towards a universalist vision. And of course, Gregory is my great hero, so I'm with him. The other thing I'd say that's interesting is you notice the natural depravity. You focused on that phrase. It's very interesting, because the healthier tradition, and you see this not only in Gregory and the other Cappadocians, but in Maximus the Confessor with almost extraordinary genius, and others,
and
is
Nicholas.
Is that our natural condition is not depraved. Our natural condition is an absolute orientation of the will towards God, which is never absent from us. We are all always seeking God, even when we don't think we are or don't want to be. What's unnatural is that what our deliberative, our gnomic will does, because of its confusion, because of its anger, because of the things that it cannot control and the things it has failed to control because it's imperfect. And so natural depravity, and that is an almost meaningless term, is an almost meaningless phrase in that context. And that makes sense of the word hamartia. Hamartia means not wanting or rejecting the end. It's failing to reach it. It's a falling short. It's a falling away. It's a going astray. But that's literally what the word means. But it presumes you can't go astray unless you're already oriented towards that end that you fail to reach.
So natural depravity, that phrase used by Calvin, is an oxymoron.
Yeah, and I think that's true of, if you really pay attention to what Paul is saying and you pay attention to the theology of the New Testament, that's the biblical view.
Yes, and you're right. I mean, the word hamartia does not imply any kind of natural depravity. In fact, it implies the opposite, because if I miss the mark, I've got to be going for the mark. Otherwise, I haven't missed it.